A coming-out lesbian rom-com without the romance? Yes. It actually exists in the form of the 2006 movie Grey Matters. I mean, there is a bit of sapphic romance, just a tiny hint of it, and for the rest it plays out as a coming-out story using all the typical rom-com elements. I suppose this was the US response to the only other sapphic rom-com that carries that polished mainstream 90s to early 2000s rom-com vibe. Imagine Me and You from 2005, but does it still hold up? Grey and her brother Sam are incredibly close. They do everything side by side, dance, run, and even share a home. When they get mistaken for a couple at a dinner party, she says, "People think we're together. Like together, like sleeping with each other together? You know what? You're definitely not the first person to think that. Thanks." They decide it's finally time to step out and look for partners. Okay, I'll find a half-ex-Hannity girl for you, and you find a guy for me who is deep, caring, and funny. Grey feels hesitant to try dating again. I see myself as this lovely hotel. It's charming, romantic, and amazing on the outside, but on the inside it needs a lot of fixing. Instead, she wants to focus on her work, because she's currently pitching to a major client and struggling. Why don't you call me when you have something more original to show? But she is still ready to help Sam find someone. While pretending to have a dog just to meet people at the park, Grey notices Charlie, and immediately sees the potential. It's obvious that Sam and Charlie quickly connect, but when they suddenly reveal they're getting married just 24 hours after meeting, Grey feels uneasy. Remember what Mom always used to say? When it's right, you just know. That worry only grows when they're in Vegas for their rushed wedding. Charlie, completely drunk, kisses Grey and her whole world turns upside down as she realizes she has feelings for Charlie. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. What does this mean for her and who she is, and what does it mean for her relationship with her brother? Do you remember that night we spent together in Las Vegas before you married Sam? Barely. I mean, I remember having fun, but I think you got me way too drunk to remember anything else. The casting is definitely worth mentioning since it features familiar Hollywood faces. Heather Graham, who has an extensive film career, but I know her best from Austin Powers and Boogie Nights. Tom Cavanaugh is also prolific, but most recently spent 9 years on the series The Flash. There is Molly Shannon as the eccentric best friend, and honestly, she almost steals the film for me. There is also some very clearly queer-coded casting. Alan Cumming from The Good Wife, who is openly bisexual. Julia Bartlett, who you will definitely recognize from The L Word, and a cameo by Gloria Gaynor, whose song I Will Survive has been embraced as a true queer anthem, suggests to me that the writer-director Sue Kramer is closely connected to the queer community. In fact, it seems the story was partly inspired by her own sister. I understand what the film is attempting, taking what is typically a serious coming-out narrative and shaping it within a rom-com structure, adding just enough variation to the familiar genre to make it seem like a fresh perspective. But it's this exact twist that, for me, becomes its main flaw, and I'll get into that in a moment. Unfortunately, it wasn't only that which contributed to a film that felt somewhat underwhelming overall. Now, the movie is definitely watchable. Don't get me wrong, it's one I remember generally enjoying when I watched it nearly 2 decades ago, but it's not one that ever really got mentioned in sapphic film and TV discussions, and after rewatching it the reason feels more obvious. First of all, the casting of Heather as Grey comes across as very straight. I didn't completely believe her as someone secretly sapphic, and it's not really because of her strong presentation, but more because I just didn't quite buy that she was attracted to women. The performance seemed more focused on portraying the usual cute, anxious, and clumsy romantic lead stereotype, and it was only during the final conversation with Charlie, when she had tears in her eyes, that I felt any real emotion there regarding her unreturned feelings. I also didn't sense any chemistry between Grey and Charlie, which maybe was intentional, so that Charlie could maintain her integrity within the story, but I still needed to believe that Charlie would drunkenly kiss Grey, and at the very least, I needed to sense the attraction from Grey's perspective. I also didn't notice much chemistry between Grey and Rachel at the end either. The film didn't do enough in my view to properly set up that final outcome earlier in the story. I could tell where it was going mainly because Julia Bartlett was cast in the role, but very little else actually hinted at it, and so they end up in a gay bar near the end of the movie, and the flirting feels flat, but then suddenly it shifts into Grey heading off for a nightcap with obvious implications, but without giving them a moment to truly connect, develop chemistry, create tension, or even share a kiss. Not to mention the cross-dressing moment from Alan Cumming's character didn't quite land either. Maybe it was okay. I understand they weren't trying to dismiss cross-dressing or trans women, but it was used as a comedic element, and in the end I didn't find it very funny. Molly Shannon's character Carrie could have been hilarious though. so I wish they had chosen her to take Charlie to her first gay bar instead. But this really highlights a bigger issue with the script. It felt like a mix of different successful ideas, picked and pieced together from other rom-coms and familiar tropes. I noticed some clear references to films like When Harry Met Sally, or even the classic Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire movies, and that combined with the earlier mentioned lack of emotional depth and an overall lack of charm in the writing, meant the film never fully came together, and it felt like the story didn't carry much depth. Not that rom-coms are usually very deep, and maybe the film could have gotten away with it if Gray and Charlie had been the final pairing. As I mentioned earlier, when working within a film genre, you need to present something familiar enough to meet the audience's expectations, while still adding just enough originality to make it feel new. And unfortunately here, I think creating a setup where Gray doesn't end up with the woman she loves, and then introducing a weaker last-minute alternative without proper development as a replacement, weakens a key expectation of the genre. The film carefully builds moments between Gray and Charlie, like them dancing at the beginning of the movie, going wedding dress shopping, where Gray clearly notices some attractive lingerie. They share a bath with champagne, where Charlie is completely naked. Then there's singing on stage, dancing around the living room, and of course their shared kiss. Charlie is portrayed as doing all of this innocently, but we're denied any real emotional release of Gray confessing her love for Charlie, even though it remains unreturned, which I suppose was meant to show Gray realizing she needed to move on, and instead the actual climax of the film becomes Gray and Sam reconciling after she comes out to him and tells him about the kiss. Sam, you know, just because you're completely gay and in love with my wife doesn't mean we can't fix things. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, now this is interesting. None of this is technically wrong as a story choice, but when it's presented within the rom-com structure, it doesn't fully satisfy, because the main foundation of the genre is about lovers overcoming obstacles to finally be together. Essentially, the core expectation of the genre is subverted, and as a result, we're left with a rom-com that feels like it's missing the romance. Perhaps it was simply a product of its time, and the film was shaped this way in hopes that it could transition from being a sapphic story into a mainstream rom-com, which might explain why Gray is given one final attempt to force herself into a heterosexual life by going out with men on dates, instead of exploring relationships with women to truly accept that she is gay. Maybe this disappointment doesn't hit quite as hard as the ending of Kissing Jessica Stein, since Gray was never really going to end up with Charlie. Charlie was clearly deeply in love with Sam, but it still hurts regardless. If you want to learn more about the movie Kissing Jessica Stein, which I personally think is a much better film despite its ending, then click on the video on your screen.